I didn't expect an apology. I didn't need repentance. Just a few words. We're sorry. And maybe an attempt to understand what that vase meant to me, my memory, my history. But they, my grandchildren, shattered it and simply laughed. And then their parents said, "It's just a thing." That's when I made my decision. I would take the holiday away from them. Because if a home is more than just walls, if it's also about respect, then I no longer have doors open for them. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Helen Miller, and I was 72 years old when I finally stepped into the life I had spent decades postponing. I had been a high school English teacher for nearly 40 years, the kind of teacher who annotated the margins of every book and still kept a chalkboard in her study long after whiteboards took over classrooms. I lived most of my life in the same town in Illinois where I was born, raised a son, buried a husband, and graded more essays than I could count. But retirement had a way of opening doors you'd forgotten were still there. And mine led to a small cottage nestled near the edge of a forest preserve in Oregon. It was quiet there, not the suffocating kind of silence that comes with grief, but the restorative hush that lets you exhale for the first time in years. The kind that hangs between tall trees and filters through lace curtains in the morning. My new home had a wraparound porch, creaky floorboards, and a fireplace that made the whole living room smell faintly of pine. There were 3 bedrooms, though I only used one. The others were left as they were, lightly furnished, waiting for occasional visits from family. I filled my days with long walks, worn books, and hot tea. There was a rhythm to it, the kettle whistling just before sunrise, the soft scrape of my slippers against the wooden floor, the way the morning sun painted golden rectangles across the rug. I had never needed much, just peace. And for the first time, I had it. Every room in that house held a memory, though they were mine alone. I brought with me the things that mattered most. My husband's wool coat, still carrying the faint smell of tobacco and winter, the bookshelf he built from salvaged oak, the photograph of us on our 25th anniversary, framed in brass and resting on the mantel, and the delicate blue porcelain vase he gave me on our first anniversary, back when we were young and everything felt like a beginning. That vase stood in the same place from the moment I unpacked it, on the left corner of the fireplace mantel, surrounded by a pair of hand-carved candle holders and a small wooden clock that ticked a little too loudly. The vase was never just decoration. It was the kind of object you greeted each morning without realizing it, the kind you dusted with care, not because it was valuable, but because it was loved. I never had to say out loud that it mattered. It just did. Once a month, my son Mark, his wife Gina, and their 3 children would drive down from Portland to visit. They would usually arrive on a Saturday afternoon, always unannounced but always expected. I would prepare for their visits days in advance, stocking up on juice boxes, washing the guest linens, baking something warm and sweet to greet them with. My cinnamon coffee cake was a favorite, or at least it used to be. I never asked if anyone still liked it. I just kept making it. Those weekends were noisy. The children burst through the front door with the force of a summer storm, laughing, shouting, dragging backpacks and muddy sneakers across my rugs. They were still young enough to play, but old enough to know better. I tried to smile, tried to enjoy it the way I thought a grandmother was supposed to. But each visit left me more tired than the last. Mark would greet me with a distracted kiss on the cheek, always halfway through a phone call or tapping at a screen. Gina rarely made eye contact. She would sit on the couch with her legs curled up, scrolling through her phone and occasionally offering parenting instructions without looking up. The children, Jack, Ellie, and little Lily, would tear through the house like it belonged to them. And maybe, in their minds, it did. I tried to set rules gently. I asked them not to run in the hallway, not to open the china cabinet, not to touch the figurines by the window. But my voice was just one of many sounds in the house, no louder than the wind or the creak of the stairs. Mark never reinforced anything I said. Gina would sigh and tell me, "They're just kids." And so the boundaries blurred. Still, I never raised my voice, never lost my temper. I believed in patience, in letting things go. I told myself this was just a new rhythm, that children bring chaos, and that chaos, too, can be a kind of music. I adjusted. I let the days play out. After they left, I would clean, silently, wiping handprints from windows, picking up stray socks from under the couch, folding blankets no one had asked for, but everyone had used. I would put the house back in order, restoring the quiet one object at a time. Only then would I feel like myself again. I didn't mind the effort, not really. What I minded was the fading sense that this space, my sanctuary, was slowly becoming something else, not hostile, just indifferent, as if the meaning I had placed in every corner was invisible to everyone else. I began to notice little things. The rug in the hallway was constantly rumpled from being stepped on with careless feet. The tea towels I embroidered myself had stains I couldn't scrub out. Books were pulled from shelves and left open-faced on the floor. My routines, my rituals, all undone in the space of a weekend. But I said nothing. I nodded, I served, I cleaned. Because that's what good mothers do. That's what grandmothers do. Or so I thought. Until the day came when silence would no longer be enough. It always began the same way. The sound of tires crunching down the gravel driveway, the car door slamming, the high-pitched squeals of my grandchildren calling out as they raced toward the front steps. My body would react before my thoughts did. An involuntary flinch in my shoulders, a bracing of nerves. I stood in the kitchen most weekends around this time, placing the final touches on whatever I had baked. Banana bread, brownies, a tray of lemon bars, and telling myself that it would be fine, that this visit would be better. The front door burst open. Voices layered over voices. Shoes thudded against the wood floor. Laughter, shrieks, the sound of something plastic being dropped, then kicked. It was always like this, a sudden storm that overtook the stillness I had so carefully maintained all week. Jack was the oldest, 10 and full of energy that bordered on aggression. He saw boundaries as challenges to be tested. Ellie was 8 and had a wildness in her that was both magnetic and exhausting. She spoke in nonstop bursts of opinion and imagination, rarely pausing to breathe. Little Lily, the youngest, was just 6, but kept up with the others, like a shadow with its own chaotic will. I loved them. I truly did. But love, I had come to understand, does not always come wrapped in ease. Within minutes of arrival, the house would transform. Coats thrown on chairs, backpacks in the hallway, crumbs trailing from the kitchen to the living room. I used to ask them to take their shoes off when they came inside. That tradition had quietly disappeared. They didn't even notice when I placed the shoe rack back near the front door. Gina settled herself on the couch as always, legs tucked under her, phone in hand. Her face lit by the blue glow of a screen, she would scroll endlessly, barely glancing up. Occasionally, she murmured something about snacks or screens or schedules, but her voice was more an ambient sound than active participation. Mark stayed on his phone, too, though he sometimes wandered the house, speaking loudly into his earpiece, taking business calls as if he weren't in his mother's home, mid-visit. I moved around them like a ghost hostess, offering drinks, cleaning up as they made messes, fixing what they disturbed. I told myself this was just the rhythm of modern family life, that I was old-fashioned, that I was the one who needed to adjust. But it wasn't just the volume of sound, it was the weight of it, how it filled the air and pressed down on my chest, how it lingered long after they were gone. One afternoon, I came into the living room to find Ellie jumping on the couch with shoes still on. Not just bouncing, but launching herself from cushion to cushion like a trampoline. A lamp nearby wobbled with every landing. I asked her gently to stop. She looked at me, shrugged, and said she was playing a game. When I repeated myself, she flopped dramatically onto the floor and groaned. Jack was in the hallway, using the walls as goals for his invisible soccer match. The picture frames along the stairs were crooked, some tilted so severely I was sure they'd fall. I reached out to straighten one, only to realize the glass was cracked. No one said a word about it. In the kitchen, Lily had spilled juice all over the counter. Instead of wiping it up, she dipped her fingers into the puddle and smeared little circles across the surface, giggling at the sticky design. Gina looked up briefly, then returned to her screen. I reached for a towel and said nothing. Later that evening, after they had gone out for a walk without inviting me, I sat at the dining room table and looked around. Everything was shifted. My woven placemats were stained. One of my candlesticks was missing. The rug in the entryway was bunched up and muddy. The living room throw blanket had chocolate fingerprints on the edge. My house, my space, had become something else entirely. It felt less like a home and more like a waiting room for people who didn't look up when they entered. It wasn't just disorder. It was disregard. I remembered how my husband used to help me prepare for company. He would polish the silver, place fresh flowers in a vase, turn on the record player with something gentle playing in the background. Hosting had once been an act of grace, of welcome. Now it felt like an act of endurance. When they returned that night, the children rushed past me, Lily knocking into the side table as she passed. A porcelain trinket I had bought years ago in a tiny antique shop in Vermont wobbled, spun, and fell. It shattered on the floor. None of them noticed. I bent down slowly and began picking up the pieces. My hands didn't shake, but my heart did. No one apologized. No one offered to help. And for the first time, I asked myself why I kept letting this happen. Why I kept inviting this noise into my life, thinking it was the same thing as joy. I had confused sound for connection, movement for meaning. I swept the floor clean and turned off the lights. And in the darkness of that quiet house, I heard myself think clearly for the first time in months. The vase stood on the mantel in the living room for nearly 35 years. It wasn't just any vase. It was pale blue porcelain, hand-painted with delicate white cranes and reeds curling across the curved surface. My husband gave it to me on our first wedding anniversary. He had found it in a little antique shop while on a business trip in Charleston. I still remembered the way he wrapped it in a scarf and presented it to me like it was something sacred. He never had a flair for grand gestures, but that vase had been his quiet way of saying he saw me, that he knew beauty mattered to me, that I mattered to him. Every time I dusted it, I paused for a moment to admire the glaze, the balance of its form, the subtle shimmer it caught in the light of early morning. It wasn't expensive, not in any way that would impress a collector, but it had value, deep, aching value. It had been with me through joy and grief, through silence and storms. After my husband passed, I would sometimes sit in the armchair across from it and just look at it, letting memories settle over me like a shawl. My grandchildren knew not to touch it. I had told them many times, gently but firmly, that it was special. I even placed a small card beside it once that said, "Please do not touch," written in cursive on heavy paper. But children don't always read signs, and adults don't always repeat them. That morning had started like most others when they visited. Noise, crumbs, forgotten shoes. I was in the kitchen, rinsing dishes from breakfast, when I heard the sound, a sharp, brief crash, then silence. My hands froze in the soapy water. For a moment, I stood still, hoping it was something else, a dropped toy, a tray from the oven, something unimportant. But when I turned the corner into the living room, I saw it. The vase, my vase, was in pieces on the floor, shattered, splintered porcelain scattered across the rug like pale bones. I couldn't move. The children stood nearby, Jack holding a rubber ball, Ellie with wide eyes, Lily clutching her doll. No one said a word. Then Jack laughed, not out of cruelty, but from the awkward energy children carry when they know they've done something wrong but don't feel the weight of it. Ellie followed nervously. Lily looked at me, then at the floor. I looked for Gina. She was on the couch again, scrolling through her phone. She looked up, saw the mess, and blinked once before speaking. "It's just a vase, right?" Just a vase. Something inside me recoiled. I felt it in my throat first, then down into my chest, pressing tight against my ribs. The words stung more than the shatter itself, not because of what they said, but because of everything they didn't. There was no apology. No, "Are you okay?" No acknowledgement that something precious had been lost. Only inconvenience, dismissal, the weightless tone of someone who did not understand what it means to hold on to things when so much else has been taken away. I knelt down slowly. My knees ached on the hardwood floor. I began collecting the shards with my bare hands, cradling them in the hem of my apron like fragile eggshells. I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. The silence said everything. One piece still held the outline of a crane's wing. Another, the curve of the rim I used to dust so carefully. I picked them up with a reverence they didn't deserve to lose. Every broken fragment was a small obituary to something sacred. I carried the pieces to the kitchen and placed them gently into a cardboard box, the same box that had once held birthday decorations. I set it on the highest shelf of the pantry, not ready to decide what came next. That evening, I made dinner. I stirred the soup, set the table, laid out napkins, but I didn't take the extra time to slice fruit or warm the bread. I didn't place a candle in the center. I didn't reach for the china. We ate in silence, broken only by the clink of silverware and the hum of the refrigerator. After the children had gone to bed, I stood alone in the living room, staring at the empty space on the mantel. It looked hollow, like a tooth had been pulled from a familiar smile. The crane-less shelf, the uneven balance, the silence of something that should be there and wasn't. The room hadn't changed, but I had. Something in me knew then that lines had been crossed, not by the children, but by the ones who should have taught them better. I wasn't angry. I wasn't looking for restitution. I was looking for recognition, for someone to notice the damage and say it mattered. But no one did, so I made a quiet promise to myself. If no one else would protect the peace of my home, I would. Even if that meant closing the door to those who didn't understand what they had broken. The next morning, the house felt heavier than usual, the kind of heaviness that settled not in objects or space, but in air, in the pauses between footsteps, in the corners where light used to fall more kindly. I woke early, as always, and went about my routine. I opened the curtains, fed the cat, boiled the kettle, but everything moved slower. I didn't hum to myself. I didn't set out the fancy mugs. I didn't reach for the cinnamon tin. There was no point. The children were still asleep. Their shoes were left in a pile by the back door, mud dried on the soles and crusted along the entryway tile. I picked them up and lined them against the wall without comment, as I had done so many times before. The scuff marks on the baseboards, the fingerprint smudges on the mirror, the wrinkled towels on the floor. All these things had become familiar, but that morning I noticed them differently. Not as the leftovers of energy, but as the remnants of disregard. I prepared breakfast quietly: toast, butter, a pot of black tea. I didn't make pancakes or fruit salad or the scrambled eggs with cheese that Jack used to like. I didn't ask if anyone wanted anything special. I set 5 plates on the table out of habit, but I didn't add the cloth napkins or fresh flowers like I usually did when family came to stay. The table looked bare, honest. When they finally came down, Mark first, then Gina, followed by the kids, I greeted them with a nod. No smile, just enough acknowledgement to fill the space and nothing more. I poured the tea and passed the toast. The children dug in, asking questions, telling stories, talking over each other. I said very little. They didn't seem to notice. The vase never came up. No one mentioned it. No one asked about the box I had carefully moved to the highest shelf in the pantry. There were no glances toward the empty mantel, no apology, no explanation. The absence of the vase had already been folded into the landscape of the house, as though it had never mattered, as though its silence was permission. After breakfast, I sat in my armchair with my cup of tea and watched the sunlight spread across the floor. The warmth that used to feel comforting now only reminded me of what had shifted. It was as if the house itself had taken a breath and now held it in, waiting for me to decide what came next. Gina went back to her phone. Mark answered work emails. The children bickered over a board game they didn't know how to play correctly. The instructions crumpled on the floor beneath them. I watched them all, not with resentment, but with clarity. I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. I was simply done pretending that my home was still being shared. It wasn't. It had been overtaken. When Lily asked for juice and knocked over a cup in the same breath, I wiped the spill with a towel and said nothing. When Ellie shouted at Jack and Mark told her, absently, to be nice, I didn't intervene. I had spent years holding things together. This time, I let them unravel. I waited for someone, anyone, to ask me how I was feeling, to ask if I wanted help cleaning up, to ask about the vase. But they didn't. They talked and moved and occupied space without ever acknowledging the person who had made it all possible. My presence had become a backdrop, a stage on which they performed their version of family, never pausing to check if the walls still held. After lunch, they packed up to leave. The visit had come to its usual end. Coats were grabbed, backpacks zipped, leftovers shoved into plastic containers. Gina kissed me on the cheek. Mark said they'd see me soon. The kids ran out to the car, laughing, yelling, already asking for drive-through food. I stood in the doorway, watching the taillights disappear down the gravel road. And then I closed the door. I didn't cry. I didn't exhale in relief. I simply returned to the kitchen, poured the rest of the tea into my cup, and sat back down. The chair was still warm. The table was still messy. The silence felt different now, no longer something I tolerated, but something I had earned back. That night, I didn't put the box of vase fragments away. I took it down and set it on the table. I lifted each piece and laid them out like a puzzle, not to fix it, not to restore it, just to understand it, just to remember. I didn't blame the children for what happened. I blamed the adults who taught them that nothing sacred needed protecting. As I turned the last shard in my hand, I thought about thresholds, about how easily we let others cross them, about how quietly they forget they've been allowed in. And I realized that sometimes the only way to protect something is to close the door and pour the tea alone. The decision came quietly, without drama or fury. It did not arrive in the night or strike me in the middle of some emotional storm. It settled into me like a long, slow exhale, inevitable and final. I had been holding too much for too long, the weight of unspoken things, of overlooked moments, of small, constant disregards, and the vase, though broken and boxed away, had become something much bigger, a symbol, a line, and I had finally reached it. 2 days after they left, I woke up before the sun and sat down at the old writing desk in my bedroom. It was the same desk I'd graded essays on for years, the same one where I'd written thank you notes and sympathy cards and grocery lists. I opened the drawer and took out my best stationery, the cream-colored paper with the gold edge I only used when something mattered. I smoothed the sheet against the blotter and picked up my pen. I didn't rush. I began with a greeting, polite and measured. I addressed the letter to Mark and Gina, though I knew it was really for me. I thanked them for their visit, listed the usual things: safe travel, good weather, how much the children had grown. Then I paused. I could feel the air shift in the room, the way it does right before you open a window. I told them I needed a break. I said that I would not be hosting anyone for the upcoming holiday, that I needed time and space to reset, to reflect. I explained it in simple, gentle language, not accusatory, not sharp, but unmistakably firm. I did not mention the vase. I did not catalog the noise, the mess, the forgotten manners. I did not ask for an apology. That would have missed the point. What I needed wasn't an admission. It was a boundary. I wrote that I loved them, all of them, but that love was not the same as sacrifice. That family did not excuse carelessness. That this home, my home, was a place built on meaning, and that meaning had to be protected. I wrote that I hoped they would understand. I wrote that I hoped they would listen. But most of all, I wrote it because I needed to say it, for myself. When I finished, I read the letter aloud once, quietly. My voice didn't shake. The words didn't feel foreign in my mouth. They felt right. I folded the paper with care, slid it into an envelope, and sealed it. Then I wrote their names across the front in my neat teacher's script. No flourish, just truth. I walked it to the end of the driveway that morning. The box stood still in the misty air, quiet and blue and waiting. I opened the lid, placed the letter inside, and let it go. Back in the house, I poured a fresh cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching the fog lift off the fields in the distance. The silence felt softer than it had in days, less like loneliness, more like ownership. I had done something for myself, not to hurt, not to punish, but to draw a line that had been missing for too long. That afternoon, I turned off my phone, not to shut anyone out, but to hear myself more clearly. I didn't want to see messages full of passive disappointment or feigned confusion. I didn't want to read the kinds of words people write when they're afraid to look inward. I wanted stillness. I wanted space. The house responded in kind. It seemed to breathe differently, as if grateful. I opened the windows. I aired out the rooms. I moved slowly through each one, reclaiming it, wiping counters, fluffing pillows, putting things back in places where they belonged. Not because they'd been ruined, but because they'd been unsettled. That night, I sat on the porch and watched the stars come out. The chill in the air crept along my skin. but I didn't move to go inside. I stayed until the sky turned deep and full. I thought about the years I had spent giving everything I had, the time, the patience, the grace, and how rarely it had been met with the same. The letter would arrive in a day or two. They would read it, they might call, they might not, but I didn't need to prepare for either outcome because the letter wasn't a request. It was a declaration, and I had written it without fear. The days that followed the letter were quiet in a way that felt earned, like a slow exhale after years of holding my breath. For the first time in what felt like ages, the silence wasn't something that descended upon me. It was something I stepped into deliberately. It wasn't loneliness. It was space, my space, reclaimed, respected, and finally listened to. I began each morning without the anticipation of footsteps racing down the hall or the clatter of dishes dropped too carelessly in the sink. The absence of noise no longer felt like a void, but a canvas. I lingered in bed longer, not because I was tired, but because I could. I read chapters at a time instead of stolen paragraphs. I made my tea slowly and drank it by the window without glancing at the clock. There was no rush. There was only rhythm. In the first week, I found myself drawn to little things I had long neglected. I reorganized the spice cabinet, not out of necessity, but for the quiet pleasure of putting things in order. I polished the silver frame that held my wedding photo and placed it on the mantel where the vase had once stood. I didn't try to replace the vase. Nothing could. But I didn't leave the space empty either. I filled it with something else that carried memory, just softer, less fragile. I repotted my plants. I deep cleaned the pantry. I opened boxes I hadn't touched since the move and found old letters, notes from former students, a stack of postcards from my sister who had passed years ago. I cried once, just once, while holding a birthday card my husband had written in a shaky hand the year before he died. But the tears didn't linger. They came like rain on a roof, brief, necessary, and cleansing. I began to walk each evening, not far, just a loop around the neighborhood. The air in Oregon carried a stillness I hadn't known in the Midwest, a kind of softness in the way it cooled your skin without biting. I passed houses with porch lights glowing warmly. A few neighbors waved. I waved back. I didn't make small talk. I didn't need to. Inside the house, the energy shifted. It felt less like something I was managing for others and more like something I was curating for myself. I moved the armchair closer to the window so I could sit in the light in the late afternoons. I brought out the quilt I had sewn years ago and draped it over the couch. I played old records in the evenings, soft jazz, piano, sometimes Simon and Garfunkel if the mood called for it. The music didn't fill the room. It breathed with it. One morning, I took the box of vase fragments down from the pantry shelf. I didn't open it at first. I simply placed it on the kitchen table and sat beside it with a cup of tea. The box held weight, not just physical but emotional, a silent ledger of everything that had been broken, dismissed, brushed aside. I lifted the lid and looked inside. The pieces hadn't shifted. They lay there, as they had before, delicate and defeated. I took each one out, laid them on a towel, and arranged them gently. There was no intention to repair, just to witness, to honor what had mattered. As I laid out the pieces, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I felt a stillness, an acceptance. The brokenness no longer felt violent. It felt truthful. The vase had been beautiful. It had been loved. And now it was gone. That was real. And that was enough. I placed the largest shard in a shadow box, a piece with the edge of a painted crane's wing. I hung it in the hallway near the door, not where it would be seen by everyone, just by me, a reminder not of loss, but of the strength it takes to protect the things that cannot be replaced. That evening, I cooked for myself a proper meal, roasted vegetables, a baked potato with butter and herbs, a small glass of wine. I set the table with a cloth napkin and lit a candle, not out of loneliness, but as an act of grace, the kind of small ritual I used to do for others, now offered to myself. I didn't check my email that day. I didn't listen for the phone. I knew the letter had arrived. I knew they had read it. But I also knew this moment, this quiet, this house. None of it needed their reply to have meaning. This was the space I had built, and I was finally living in it. It had been nearly 3 weeks since I sent the letter, and the quiet had not broken. The phone stayed silent. My inbox remained empty, save for the usual newsletters and appointment reminders. There were no cars pulling into the drive, no unexpected visits, no last-minute apologies, and I hadn't expected any. That, perhaps, was the most peaceful part of all. I had settled into a new rhythm, slower, deeper. I walked more, sat longer, listened harder. The walls of the house seemed to breathe more easily, like they were grateful to simply be a home again and not a hallway for chaos. I found myself talking aloud to no one in particular, sometimes narrating what I was doing, sometimes reading poetry aloud just to hear a voice in the room. It never felt lonely. It felt honest. Then, one Thursday afternoon, there was a knock at the door. It was soft, uncertain, not the hurried pounding of children, not the impatient rhythm of a delivery person. I stood still for a moment in the hallway, surprised more than anything. My mind ran through possibilities, none of them urgent, none of them serious, just unexpected. I opened the door slowly, and there she was, Lily. She stood on the front step wearing a pink sweatshirt with sleeves slightly too long, a backpack hanging loosely from one shoulder, and her hair pulled into two uneven pigtails. She looked smaller than I remembered, though maybe that was just the distance that had grown between us. In her hands, she held something, a folded note and a homemade card, clearly crafted by small hands and colored with thick markers. The front was a drawing, 3 stick figures standing in front of what looked like my house, with the word sorry written in careful block letters across the top. My chest tightened. She didn't speak, neither did I. I stepped aside and let her in. She walked quietly to the kitchen, as if remembering every creak in the floor. I followed, still unsure if I was dreaming. We sat at the table, her in the chair closest to the window, me in my usual seat with the cushion worn just right. She placed the card on the table and then pushed the note toward me. Her eyes stayed on her hands. I opened it. The handwriting was Gina's. Short, formal, slightly rushed. She wrote that Lily had insisted on coming, that she had asked every day since they received my letter, that no one told her to apologize, that she simply wanted to. The rest of the note was polite, surface level, an attempt at diplomacy, but none of it mattered as much as the girl sitting in front of me. She finally looked up. Her eyes were wide, wet but not crying. She said nothing, just reached into her backpack and pulled out a small bag of cookies. My favorite kind, store-bought but sweet in intention. I took one, not because I needed it, but because I understood what it meant to accept a gesture even when words weren't easy. We sat in silence and shared the cookies. Eventually, she asked if we could look at the photo albums again, the ones in the hallway closet. I nodded, and she slipped off the chair, already knowing where to go. She came back with the heavy leather-bound book and placed it between us on the table. We turned the pages together. There were pictures of Mark as a boy, of me and my husband at the lake, of holidays spent in this very house when things felt fuller and simpler. Lily pointed at pictures, asking quiet questions. I told her stories, not as a teacher or a grandmother with something to prove, but as someone offering memories to someone who finally wanted to listen. We didn't mention the vase, not once. But as she flipped through the pages, she paused at one that showed the living room mantel. The vase was there in the background, standing tall, just catching a sliver of afternoon sun. Her eyes stayed on that picture a little longer. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Before she left, she hugged me. It was a shy, unbalanced hug, arms wrapped around my middle, her head pressing just under my ribs. I held her gently, and something loosened inside me, like a knot untying slowly. She stepped back, gave a small wave, and walked down the steps to where a car waited at the edge of the drive. I didn't look to see who was in it. I stood on the porch long after they drove away. The wind picked up, and I pulled my cardigan tighter around my shoulders. The sky was beginning to fade into that soft lavender that only comes in early spring, the time between warmth and cold, between dormancy and bloom. And for the first time in a long while, I realized that not every broken thing had to be erased. Some were just meant to be remembered. The call came on a Sunday evening, just as I was finishing the dishes. I had taken to doing them by hand again, not because I had to, but because I liked the way it slowed me down. The warm water soothed my fingers, and the clinking of porcelain against porcelain was a gentle rhythm I'd come to cherish. I didn't notice the phone at first, buried beneath the hush of twilight and the steam curling above the sink. When I heard it, it felt distant, as if the house itself was asking if I was ready. It was Mark. His voice sounded different, measured, a little tired, but without the usual edge of urgency that clung to our conversations. He asked about the weather, whether the lilacs had started to bloom by the porch. He asked if I'd made my pumpkin muffins lately. Small things, soft things. We floated there for a moment in polite exchanges, each of us aware that we were orbiting something larger. Then he asked if they could come for Christmas. I didn't answer right away. I dried my hands slowly, watching the light from the kitchen window fade into blue. My silence wasn't hesitation. It was consideration. This wasn't just about an invitation. It was about the meaning of presence, about the value of peace, about whether the people who once took my space for granted could now return to it with care. I told him yes, but there would be rules, not hints, not gentle nudges, not the kinds of quiet expectations I had swallowed for too long. Real rules, clear, firm, and necessary. I told him this house had earned its quiet, and if they wanted to come, they would have to meet it with respect. Shoes off at the door, no yelling indoors, no toys thrown across the hallway, no jumping on furniture, no screens at the table. Any broken item would be acknowledged, not ignored. Apologies would be made, freely, honestly, without being prompted. This house would no longer bend around everyone else's noise. It had shape now, and that shape had boundaries. There was a pause on the other end. I imagined him standing in his living room, phone pressed to his ear, staring out at something far away. Then he said he understood, that he respected that maybe I had been too forgiving for too long, and they had mistaken that for permission. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest I had heard from him in years. The following morning, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote out the rules, not in anger, but in clarity. I typed them up in large, simple font and printed them on thick paper. I pinned the list to the corkboard in the hallway where the old calendar used to hang, At the top, I wrote, "Welcome to Grandma's house," and beneath it, a quiet promise to myself, "Respect lives here." Christmas came. They arrived early, not rushed. Jack stepped out first, his arms full of wrapped boxes, and set them gently by the porch. Ellie and Lily followed, whispering to each other as they slipped off their shoes without being asked. Gina greeted me with a nod, tired but sincere. Mark held the door for everyone. Inside, the house remained itself. No sudden stampedes, no shouting matches, no toys rolling across the floor. There was laughter, yes, but the kind that belonged in rooms with bookshelves and teacups and wood grain floors. Lily hugged me without hesitation. Ellie asked if she could help set the table. Jack stared quietly at the framed photograph of the broken vase, his hands folded in front of him. We ate dinner by candlelight. The plates were real, the napkins cloth. The meal was simple and warm. Roast chicken, sweet potatoes, green beans with almonds. Conversation flowed gently, like it once did when Mark was a boy, and the world still felt small enough to hold in one room. They asked about my garden. I asked about their school projects. No one raised their voice. No one argued over devices or demanded attention they hadn't earned. After dinner, I made tea. We sat in the living room, the Christmas tree glowing quietly in the corner. I watched them all, not as a host waiting for things to go wrong, but as a woman observing her family relearning how to exist in peace. Gina caught my eye once. She didn't say anything, but her eyes softened. It was a kind of understanding that didn't need to be spoken, a recognition that maybe, just maybe, silence had done what words never could. Before they left, Mark lingered near the door. He didn't thank me for the food. He didn't mention the presents. He simply said, "Thank you for letting us come." It was a sentence wrapped in something heavier, something earned. He was thanking me for drawing the line. He was thanking me for not picking up the pieces for them anymore. He was thanking me for teaching them, even when they hadn't wanted to learn. After they left, I stood at the window and watched the tail lights fade down the road. The wind rattled softly against the glass, but inside the house it was still, balanced, whole. The rules stayed on the wall, not as barriers, but as boundaries, not as restrictions, but as reverence. This was still my home, not because I owned it, but because I protected it. And finally, the people I loved were learning to do the same.